Hello, friends. Welcome to Magic, Creativity, and Life. Interesting conversations with interesting people. My name is Thorn Coyle, and I am your host. Thank you for joining me, and thank you to my Patreon supporters for paying for the recording and captioning of this series. Let's dive in. Hello, everybody. My name is Thorn Coyle, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Magic, Creativity, and Life. And I'll be joined today by Mat Auryn. Mat is an author and teacher in the fields of occultism and witchcraft, with an audience that extends beyond the United States to an international level. His deep knowledge and experience comes from years of dedicated study, practice, and training in a variety of occult traditions and esoteric orders, often under the guidance of prominent, knowledgeable mentors. His award-winning books, Psychic Witch and Mastering Magic, offer practical insight and practices for those interested in psychic and magical development. His forthcoming books include The Psychic Art of Tarot and Pisces Witch, which he co-wrote with Ivo Dominguez Jr. These are due out this fall and available for pre-order now. And you can find him at www.auryn.net, AURYN.net. Well, hello, Mat. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Thorn, of course. It's always a delight to talk to you.
So I wanted to start off, since this is a podcast about creativity and magic, I wanted to ask you about your creative roots. Like, how did creativity manifest itself to you early on? In what forms, or was it through play or artwork or music? What was that like for you?
That's kind of a funny question, because when I was a very small child, I used to introduce myself as Matthew, the famous artist.
Wow.
And I used to say that and then tell people that I was a sensitive boy. The reason I was calling myself the famous artist is because some adults told me that, because I think it was like kindergarten or maybe first grade. I think it was kindergarten. I learned how to draw a star, very much like a pentagram.
Wow.
And I was teaching all my classmates how to do it too, which is kind of a funny like foreshadowing, because now I do a bunch of drawing pentagrams in the air and teaching people how to do that.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know if I necessarily see myself as like artistic in the traditional sense. But imagination and creativity have always been an important part of my life and my spiritual and magical practice as well.
I love that your earliest creative impulse led you to the life you are in now, right? It led you to being a teacher of psychic skills, a magic worker, a witch. That's pretty amazing. And I feel like this is where our subconscious taps into the creative impulse no matter what. And I think as children, we're better attuned to that subconscious creative impulse, don't you think?
Absolutely. One of the things that I discuss in my first book, Psychic Witch, is how children, until they're about the age of like 7 or 8, are primarily in the alpha brainwave state.
Yeah.
Which, is tied to imagination and creativity and things of that nature. So I think that beyond even just the creative impulse, I think they're more open psychically, but I also feel that those things aren't necessarily separate, creativity and like, the inner planes.
Yeah. Well, and our earliest ages, we also, unless something kind of traumatic happens at a young age, we have to learn boundaries. We are less boundaried, which I think helps our psychic connections and our creative connections too.
Absolutely.
Right? Boundaries are something we have to develop as we age and as society impinges upon us.
Absolutely. And one of the things I also discuss is I found it really interesting that although I don't think these two things have been correlated, I kind of saw a correlation that in sociology, around that age is also when the child really starts to develop a sense of how they should be acting, and how they
Right.
act and present themselves reflects upon people's perception of them.
Right. Right, which is where we get into trouble with language and children. I talk about this in my writing business book that's coming out about, growth mindset versus fixed mindset. And fixed mindset is telling a child, oh, you're so smart, or oh, you're so nice looking, right? Those are telling a child that they are something and that is unchangeable. Whereas if we say, oh, you must have worked really hard on that project, what a great job you did, or oh, I love the care you took in picking out your outfit today, right? That tells a child they have autonomy in their lives and that they can grow and change with life.
I love that. That's awesome. I'm excited to read it. I'm a big fan of your work, as you know.
Oh,
So,
thanks. Mutual fan club. So, when did you start writing?
um, so I started writing seriously probably 2000. I was just trying to think about this the other day. I need to track it down. It wasn't that long ago that I started writing. I started writing on my own personal website,
Mm-hmm.
just kind of my own musings on spiritual things. And then I got an invitation to write for Patheist Pagan by Jason Mankey. And then from there, that really kind of took off and became a really popular blog. And then I was asked about submitting a manuscript to Llewellyn.
Mm-hmm.
So I proposed an idea and it got rejected. And they were like, try to think of something else. And so what came from that second proposal was Psychic Witch.
And of course, Psychic Witch, for those who don't know, it's an excellent book and it's now, sold I don't know how many copies and been translated into how many languages, right?
Yeah, yeah, it just hit 200,000, which is I only know that because it's now on Llewellyn's ultimate bestseller list. It's the
Wow.
first in 20 years to hit it, so I'm really proud of that. And I'm really honored that it's been so well received. It's exceeded any expectations I had. I just hoped a couple people would read it and not hate it.
I think it's the right book at the right time, which when that happens, it's so perfect. And I'd like to ask you regarding writing and especially regarding Psychic Witch, that first book, what role did you allow your subconscious to play in writing that book? And how can you talk a little bit, if it's not too difficult a question, about the interplay between the subconscious and conscious mind in writing a book about psychic practice and psychic development?
Yeah, so this is a topic that I have to discuss with the right audience, which you are, because it's
Mm-hmm.
very, very woo sounding. So I was asked by Teresa Reed in a written interview how long it takes me to write a book.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer is twofold. On one hand, it takes about a year to 2 years, and
Mm-hmm.
then it also takes about like a couple months.
Right.
Because those couple of years is very much like a gestation stage.
Yes.
And the experience that I've had, so like I'll come up with all these different book ideas and they don't always manifest, but then I will start having dreams, and those dreams will start to convey things like, this is the title of your book. This
Mm-hmm.
is the animal or the image to put on your book. This is a little bit of what's in the contents of the books. So there's definitely something in my unconscious that's coming
Mm-hmm.
through, and I believe I'm being directed in
Mm-hmm.
this path. And I think it's very much like how the ancient Romans and the ancient Greeks believed that inspiration and creativity was something that wasn't from the person, but it was
Right.
more like channeled through that genius or holy daemon.
Yep. Well, yeah, I mean, inspiration is literally like you're breathing in the breath of the gods, right? And
Right.
you're channeling that. And for the ancient Greeks, of course, imagination was a real thing. It was literally the foundation and building block of everything we create, right? Which is where we get, in contemporary times, we talk about, Platonic ideal, and we say, oh, yes, somewhere there's a ideal chair, right? All they're talking about is the foundation for our creation is rooted in the imagination.
Yes, yes, and that's also, I mean, because it's Greek as well, but a foundation of Hermeticism.
Mm-hmm.
I've been reading the works of Hanegraaff, I believe is how you pronounce it, who is like the head of some Hermetic department and teaches Hermeticism at the University of, I think it's Sweden. But what I find really interesting about his work is he believes that the word nous has been mistranslated
Mm.
through an academic bias, and because of
Mm-hmm.
that, it skewed a lot of people's perception about that. We often interpret nous as being sort of mind or logic.
Right.
And he argues that it's more along the line of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
It's the root of gnosis and noetic and words like that. And I think that makes so much more sense, this idea of, the great divine being more
Mm-hmm.
of an imaginative, creative faculty, because
Mm-hmm.
that's its nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, and how many deities in different cultures are creators and destroyers, right? Because that's another part of our creative process is we can't always just be creating. We have to let things cycle as nature cycles, right? That there's fallow times, there's dormant times, there's growth times, and there's death times even. And so it's hard, I think, for some creative people to accept that our creativity is going to cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can definitely see a difference in my own writing when I'm, forced with a deadline to write something
Mm-hmm.
versus when it goes through that more kind of organic. Um, I use the birth metaphor, and I think that's because my editor uses it.
Mm-hmm.
But that sort of, gestation period of
Mm-hmm.
something sort of organically forming before it's put out into text.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I find interesting is that you literally have dreams and you're
Yes.
literally following your dreams, which is something the world tells creative people to either do or not do. It's like, don't follow your dreams, be practical, have a fallback job, don't be a creative person. And other people are like, oh, I need to follow my dream, but I'm also not then going to have any practicality. And in my work, I've distinguished between dreams and fantasy or true desire. And for me, dreams and fantasy are ways of trying on different hats to see how they look or feel, right? And it's good, it's playful activity, and it does engage and enliven our subconscious in ways that no other activity does. But when it comes right down to actual manifestation and creation, I have to harness my will. I have to put intention into action and follow desire. And for me, desire means I'm willing to put life force behind that dream, behind that imagination, right? Otherwise, it stays in this fantastic realm of non manifestation, other than my imagination, right? So, how do you link your dreams and imagination with manifestation?
So, going back into a little bit of what I was saying earlier, I believe that the work I'm doing is part of my true will.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't necessarily know if it is my true will because I don't think it's necessarily like an endpoint.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of like a discovery. But I definitely believe that there is some sort of magic that occurs when you simultaneously surrender, but then empower that surrendering with willpower, personal willpower. In Mastering Magic, my second book, I really explore the different ideas of will and identifying will in your own body. And, will is such, we get true will from Crowley. And I think will is a word that can mislead people. I
Mm-hmm.
sort of like when you talk about desire as like following your star or
Yes.
your higher
Your,
nature.
yeah, or your inner wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah, higher inner, I mean that's all,
Yeah.
just references, not
Yes.
really the location, but yeah, I I don't know. I feel very fortunate and blessed that I can do the work that I do, and
Mm-hmm.
I do believe um, that because I don't fully see it as mine, that there's
Mm-hmm.
also something else that's sort of like clearing the path for it to manifest into actual books and actual work.
Mm-hmm.
Because I am so by nature scatterbrained most of the
Mm-hmm.
time, unless I'm like intentionally like sitting down and grounding and centering. But when I sit down to write a book, I definitely get into that sort of alpha brainwave state, that sort of like in the zone, in the flow
Mm-hmm.
kind of energy, and it just sort of comes out. I tend to find that when I think too hard about what I'm going to write or what I'm going to present, that it also blocks my creativity or the actual like manifestation of those words.
Yeah. You go into critical brain instead of creative brain.
Yes, yes. And
Yeah.
I had a lot of that struggle with the second book because, people kept asking me, which they had good intentions, but they kept asking me, like, how in the world are you going to follow
Yep.
Psychic Witch up? Like, how are you going to write something as good or even better, And so that put me in the mindset of where I wasn't initially focused on the creativity, and I just would sit at the computer and couldn't write because I was
Yep.
crippled by like how are people going to receive this. There
Yep.
was too much pressure on it,
Yep.
and I've come to this sort of conclusion that each creative project is its own thing. And if I go back to that sort of metaphor of like childbirth and children, I wouldn't want a children where I'm like, this second child's going to be better than the first, right?
Right.
I'm going to honor it for what it is, and try not to compare it because it's
Yeah.
just something totally different. And for me, that was a learning experience.
Sophomore syndrome is pretty classic, whether it's a second book, a second album,
Yes.
people often freeze up because of that, because of expectations. We allow other people's voices into our creative space. I stopped reading my reviews when I started publishing fiction regularly. I realized I had to stop reading reviews when good reviews started to do the same thing to me as they did to you, of saying, oh no, what if people don't like this book as much as they loved these other two books, right? And I'm
Right.
like, I have got to stop. I don't care if they're good reviews, bad reviews. I need to just keep those voices out of my creative space.
Yeah, I totally get that. I don't avoid reviews, but I definitely have learned not to take them to heart, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
positive or negative. Also because, I think it brings the focus on me as an
Mm-hmm.
individual. when that's not my intention
Right.
with this work. Even writing, I'm getting more comfortable with writing anecdotes and understanding why they're important. But initially, like, I didn't want to share anything about myself. I just wanted to teach the things. And it's my
Yeah.
editor who pressed me to be like, throw in some anecdotes,
Yeah.
And with the upcoming tarot book that I wrote, I think I found the balance of using anecdotes to illustrate precisely what I'm teaching in action. But I think reading reviews and taking them, I think it's really hard to read reviews and not take it to heart.
Yeah.
And I feel that while I'm not against the ego, I feel like it affects the ego too much if I let it in both a good or a negative way.
Well, yeah, really, reviews are not about us. They're about the reader, right?
Right.
So in a way, it's none of our business. I'll never forget a story Toni Morrison told about attending a book club that was discussing her book, one of her books, and she started to object to someone's opinion. And the book club leader stopped her and said, "This is no longer your book."
Yes. Yes.
Right. This is our book now, and we're having our discussion, which I just thought was marvelous.
Yeah, and I think that's very much how it feels when, you have a book published and it's out in the world. Continuing with my metaphor, it's very much like sending them off to school or sending
Yeah.
them to college. Like, you can't be there to protect it, to try to mold it anymore, to try to raise it. Like, it's out there, and how people treat it or interact with it is out of your control.
Yeah. So when you are writing, do you have a schedule? Do you write every day? Do you write every other day? What is do you have discipline around writing when you're in writing mode? What's that look like for you in your life?
Oh my God, I wish. I wish I did. When it comes to writing, I think that's part of the process of it being simultaneously multiple years feeling, but also then a couple months. It has to come organically, or else I just get in my own way with my mind. And I know I would probably be a better writer if I had a more disciplined schedule. But I also, very much like you were saying at the beginning of this, I have come to honor those fallow periods,
Yeah.
The dark moon, so to speak, or the winter of this natural process. So I look at people like you, or like Teresa Reed is a great example,
Yeah.
where it's like the discipline is like, oh my gosh, I wish I had that. But I just,
Yeah.
My chart is all water and fire with like, one earth placement,
Yeah.
which is my moon. So it's like the most ungrounded of planets. So yeah, I'm not so much disciplined or scheduled when it comes to writing. I'm a lot more disciplined and scheduled when it comes to spiritual and magical practices than
Right.
writing.
So I do want to get to your spiritual practice in a moment, but I want to continue in this vein just a little further, because I think it will be helpful to people. So as someone who doesn't consider yourself to be a disciplined creator, how do you tap into your subconscious when you're up against a hard deadline?
Oh, by panicking. I mean, that's the,
Right, but you don't want to go into critical mode.
right. It's a double-edged sword. So, I have come up against the deadline twice, the deadline panic. I'm getting better at not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
But in some ways, it kind of lights a fire under my ass to like just do it. And
Yeah.
then in between sort of crippling like anxiety, periods where like I'll literally like I'm not resting because I'm having nightmares about the deadline and stuff. Um, so yeah, I mean, I could definitely be a lot better at getting things in on time. And I'm notorious for asking for extensions and getting them multiple times to the annoyance of my publisher.
Right.
But with this last book, it wasn't like that. So I think perhaps I'm just sort of, now that it's not the first or second time that I've done this,
Yes.
it's getting a little bit easier. It was really easy with Pisces Witch. I mean, obviously that was a much smaller word count on my part. Um, and I think Pisces Witch was really good for me because it also made writing feel fun again.
Yeah.
Because there's, especially when it comes to writing for periodicals or magazines or whatever, and feeling forced to write something over and over and over again, it starts to feel more like a job, which it is. But I don't necessarily thrive under that sort of condition. Like
Yeah.
I said, I'm not good at really forcing that creativity out or the right words.
For me, I have had to make my writing play, right? I say I get to write. I don't say I have to write, you know. I want writing to be fun. And I've also, in the last couple of years, applied that to my business as well. I'm like, my business also has to have elements of fun too. It can't just be a chore. If I'm going to run my publishing business along with being a writer, I need to find enjoyment in life and I need to find the creativity in it all. And, I wonder, sometimes I think people also let their critical voice and that lack of discipline or the panic over deadlines come in because they don't believe they can do it, So I'm wondering if there's some element of imposter syndrome that the pressure cooker of a deadline puts you under, or is it something else?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, it's a couple things. One, it's like we were saying, that sophomore syndrome. Two, I don't have imposter syndrome when it comes to being a witch or a psychic, and I know a lot of people do. The
Yeah.
thing that I have imposter syndrome about is being an author, because writing isn't something I really foresaw myself doing as
Right.
a living.
Well, you were going to be a famous artist.
Right, right, without the talent. Um, but I think that writing and being an author and I have only a high school education, and even
Right.
that was extended by a year because of weirdness with Columbine and having to
Oh,
be, the goth kid.
yeah.
They kicked me out of school, which I really I was pressing as we should sue, but my parents didn't want to stir any trouble.
Right.
But I'm like, we could have totally sued for that.
Yeah.
But there was such a panic for that. And I went from being in all honors classes to just not caring. So, there's a lot of things that, I don't feel qualified when it comes to writing. My grammar is horrible.
Right.
And I find editors to have superpowers in that regard.
Yeah.
One of the things that has really helped me with this sort of imposter syndrome or getting in my own way is I've come to a place where I'm like, it's okay to write a bad draft. It's okay if it's not perfect, if it's not good, just that the thoughts get out is the most important thing, or else
Yep.
I'll kind of get in my own way and just, in the time that I could have written, 2,000 words, I've written 200,
Yeah. Yeah, it's about, for me, trusting my subconscious and trusting my intuition. And in that way, my spiritual practices and training have really served my creative practices well, right? Because I know I can put myself into this state. I can put myself closer into flow state from the very beginning. Here's a few tricks, I do to switch my brain into that mode, right? And that discipline and that commitment, I've had a lifelong commitment to spiritual practice, carries quite naturally over into my creativity now. And it just makes everything easier for me.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I've been finding for myself, whether it is writing or whether it's even my magical or my psychic practice, there's an exercise that Katrina Messenger taught me before we did the ritual that we did.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I can share it because it's unique and it's not mine, but she told me the book she got it from, and I read the book, and that's totally not an exercise. Like I saw where she found the words of what inspired the idea, but it's this centering that just totally brings me, like, it centers me on such a deep level. Like, it makes me hear. It brings me into the present. And it, it's funny because, I've taught, and I've written about so many grounding and centering exercises. But again, it's one of those, like, continually returning to the basics and finding new depths to them that, you thought you had the depth, and then you realize, oh no, it goes so much deeper and so much more powerful. And I really, I feel like Katrina gave me a gift, by teaching me that. Like, it was a very special moment for me.
Yeah, sometimes we just need to come at our practices from a different angle, which is one reason I've studied so many things, and I know you have as well. And then I take those different lenses and apply them to my own practice. And certainly for me, before I write anything, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, the first thing I do is center myself. And I drop my attention down into my core, into my center, instead of letting it, bounce around inside my brain, right? And just the sensation of saying, I'm going to take a breath, I'm going to drop my attention and connect with the project in front of me, connect with my characters or my story or this piece of nonfiction I'm writing. If I take just 30 seconds to a minute to do that first, everything flows much better because my critical brain is now out of the way.
Yes. And that's absolutely what I'm finding as well. And I think it's really interesting because I am not one of those people that really thinks in language. Like, I don't really have that inner narrator. I can turn it on. So, like, the fact that I even write books at all, kind of baffles me, because it's sort of like, it's how I imagine aphantasia is, but with that sort of inner dialogue of language. But I do find that, that grounding and that centering has been really helpful in writing the last book that I just did, particularly because, these aren't things that I necessarily think of when it comes to the more mundane activities in life, like sitting down at the computer and writing, because my normal go-to is to grab a cup of coffee and just, like, caffeine out, and let the words come. But I'm finding that the opposite is actually a lot more helpful to me.
Well, and I also want to point out another important thing, which you've touched on, which is this is now your fourth book that you just finished, right? And that means you've had, excuse me, I'll edit that out. This is the fourth book you have completed, and that means you've had more practice.
Yes.
Right? So, of course, you're more comfortable. And I think creative people put a lot of pressure on ourselves to get it right out the gate the first time. We know what we're doing. Surely successful artists and creators all know what they're doing, which just isn't true, which is why we've got all the stories about you have to throw 100 pots to get your one good pot. You can't just work on one pot for 10 years, right? And so I love that you are discovering, oh, right, with more practice, the process is easier for me.
Yes. But I mean, that's like everything, right? Anything
Yeah.
that's creative or spiritual. One of the reasons that I named my upcoming book The Psychic Art of Tarot is I really approach tarot and mostly psychic ability related to tarot as being compared to art, the arts. And I draw on those metaphors a lot. And I'm finding that, like I was saying, I don't feel like I'm necessarily that artistic, but sort of discovering other art forms like clay has been really kind of driving that home of that sort of practicing and developing, something that's totally new for me.
Yeah, so what's that like for you, working with clay and making the clay figures you've been practicing with lately?
Yeah, so I chose to do it as something that was play. I went in with the intention of like, I'm not going to monetize this. I don't even share a lot of it. Like, I shared some of it near the beginning. But for me, it's been really interesting to just allow my personal creativity to just play and like not really hold myself to any sort of standards or expectations. And a lot of times I don't even know what I'm making until, the clay kind of shows me like, oh, this is the little creature it's becoming. And I kind of follow that. And what I particularly love about it too is it really taps into my inner child.
Yeah.
Particularly because the things that I like to make are the things that I grew up loving, like Jim Henson Creature Shop, those sort of like labyrinth and dark crystal type creatures.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because it's totally different than writing or even like drawing or painting, which I've tried dabbling in the past, and it makes me want to explore even more avenues of creativity. Like perhaps I should pick up music, just because I find that it's also changing my perception of how I think it's changing how my brain works and how it looks at things.
Yeah. I think that's terrific. And especially allowing yourself to, man, I don't know what's up with my voice. I will edit that as well.
Okay.
I think allowing yourself to engage in playfulness regarding creativity is so important. I know in my life, I have monetized a lot of my art forms, and it does change our relationship to it. And it's one reason why I won't monetize my photography, even though people have asked me about, having a show or making a book or selling prints. And I'm like, no, I'm very clear that my photography is for me. It's part of how I connect with the world and notice the world around me. And I'm happy to share it, but I have to share it with no expectations.
Yes,
Yeah.
I absolutely feel the same way. And, I obviously have no problem with people monetizing their talents
Yes.
and their skills. But for me, there's been something so liberating and healing about just, like you said, doing it just for me, without any of that.
Yeah. So, on that level, I'm wondering about being a person who clearly has spiritual practices and rituals that you do that are just for you and just for your personal connection. And yet you are simultaneously someone who is writing books on practice and teaching practice.
Yes.
How do you work that dance? How do you make that work in your life so that you are not making everything for public consumption and you're continuing to refill your own well, but figuring out what you can offer? I know that was a big question, so
Yes.
take whatever strand of it speaks to you.
Yes, so I found that to be a learning curve as well. There definitely were periods of burnout, but what I do in my private practice is almost identical to what I share, but not always.
Right.
Particularly, I'm trying to teach people skill sets and not necessarily, a religion,
Right.
or their personal connection with the divine. So that's a little bit different. Like my personal practice is very deity specific, with the deities that I work with. I also, I have things that are very personal to me, that I won't share. And it's not necessarily that it's, a skill set that would help people, but it's more of that, that personal thing that's just for me. I think it's very similar to, when I was sort of earlier on this path and I started having interactions with deity and spirits, I needed to share every interaction,
Yeah.
with people. And there just became a point where it was like, this isn't for other people, this is specifically for me and my path. So I think I answered that. That was a
Yeah.
big question. So
Yeah. No, you did. You did.
Okay.
Thank you. So my next question is, what does magic mean to you, the word magic, and why is it important to you?
So, yes, that's another really big question.
Yeah.
So I can't use the word magic without using the word witch, because witch is my home base of all of my spiritual exploration. It's my launching pad for me. Magic I see as this sort of. So I grew up on like Llewellyn books as a kid, like 90s Llewellyn books. And one of the things they always shared, which is not necessarily accurate, but it was a folk etymology that the word witch comes from Wicca, and Wicca means to shape or to bend. And I see magic as the conscious manipulation of energy, projective energy. And that ties into a foundational idea of my first book, Psychic Witch, which is that psychic ability. It's that same thing. It's just the input, the receiving of that energy. But taking those definitions for me and then applying the word witch for me, the way that I personally define witch is being the art of relationship. Relationship with ourselves, with our land, with other people, with the spirits. It's all about interaction, and what comes from that interaction. So it's not quite Crowley's definition. One of his definitions that's less popular is he's pretty much just like anything that involves will, and he gives metaphors of like going to the grocery store. I think it's more about consciously interacting with forces to create a change.
Yeah, there has to be consciousness and intention for me for it to be magic.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think that that's what differs, practices like prayer versus magic or spells, in my point of view, is I feel like there's a lot more of a proactiveness and a more of an engagement of the self, more of a responsibility, personal accountability and responsibility that shows up in that sort of co-creation of that relationship.
Right, and we're always co-creating with everything in the cosmos. Much as people would like to think we live in a vacuum, we don't, right? And, I think there is a way, though, in which I use the word magic differently sometimes. Mostly it's what we've just talked about, but there is something about being open to the magic that's all around us. And for that, it's about that relationship you were talking about, with the fact that there's possibility everywhere, right? So there's something about acknowledging being present enough in our lives on a daily basis to be aware of that possibility that's everywhere. And that, to me, helps us live a more magical life.
Yes, I love that. I am definitely a potential person.
Yeah.
And I think that's very much what you're saying. This idea of, I actually discussed this in the tarot book. I discussed the idea of fate and free will.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think there are things that are definitely set in stone, things that we can't actively change. And I think this also brings in the factors of like privilege and, access to resources and things of that nature. But I do believe that we always have the potential and the possibility of how we respond to those things and trying to make the best of it we possibly can.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks for bringing that up. It gets easy sometimes for people to ignore things like oppression and privilege in these discussions, so I thank you for acknowledging that. To wrap up, I'm going to ask you another big question that you can answer as simply or complexly as you wish, and that is, when you take a breath and are present in your life, what is your current why?
Why I do that?
Your big why. What is your current big why? Am I doing what I'm doing in my life? What is my current purpose?
So my current understanding of this question is alignment with my current understanding of where my true will is taking me, which is, I believe at this point in my path, that what the work that I'm doing right now is teaching people to re-enchant the world, to see the world through, like you were saying, that possibility lens, as well as understanding that they aren't just bystanders in their own lives, in the world, and sometimes that looks very magical, sometimes that looks very mundane. But particularly, it's interesting because today was the solar eclipse, and we had, of course, the certain evangelical sects that were like, it's the apocalypse, it's the rapture, right? That's coming. And one of the things that I feel like my work is leading me towards is this idea of getting rid of the narrative of that sort of end of the world.
Yeah.
Because I think that, we hold this in our culture, particularly us in, the United States and Western worlds where Christianity is a societal thing that's ingrained in a lot of us. I think that just kind of holding that sort of belief creates an expectation, both mundanely and magically, for things to fall apart, as opposed to holding that new prophecy of hope and revival
Yes.
and change, and taking that stewardship back and not being a passenger.
Yeah.
So at the moment, that's where I feel my why is.
That's terrific. Thank you. And may we all continue to invoke hope during these times. Well, thanks so much for being here, Matt. I really have appreciated this conversation.
Oh, it's been an honor. Thank you, Thorn.
And to everyone listening, I hope you have a creative, magical day. Take care. You can find out more about Matt's work at auryn.net. That's auryn.net. And as usual, you can find me at thorncoyle.com. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. And if you would like to support this series and future podcasts, please join me at patreon.com/thorncoyle. That's THORNCOYLE. Have a creative and magical day.